message in our secular forum is that we're in a world where investors are no longer having to reach for yield. We've now seen or are in the middle of a generational reset in quality fixed income bond yields, and so investors should seize that yield advantage.
You led PIMCO's forum since you rejoined PIMCO in 2022 and published our Outlook Yield Advantage together with our group CIO, Dan Iverson. So what are some of the key themes, Rich? Can you walk us through?
Inflation in the U.S. and across the world and advanced economies fallen back close to target. Central banks have not only stopped hiking rates, they're starting to talk about cutting rates. The ECB has actually cut rates along with some other central banks. There was a growth slowdown in Europe, but in the U.S. we had, if anything, a pickup in growth in 23 and a decline in the unemployment rate to a 50-year low, no real financial instability. We've now seen or are in the middle of a generational reset in quality fixed income bond yields, and so investors should seize that yield advantage.
Whichever who wins in the election, the U.S. deficit budget will be a loser to that election.
Yeah.
So, if that's not going away anytime soon, how much of a risk does this pose?
We think that a lot of the macro monetary policy and inflation risk is now much better balanced. Some of that risk is migrated over to fiscal policy in the following sense. Governments, we think, going forward, U.S. included, will have less fiscal space available to deal with future downturns. Interest payments on the U.S. debt now exceed the defense budget. We do think already we're starting to see implications of deficits and debt in global bond markets. We think that investors going forward will need to and will be compensated for taking on duration risk by earning a term premium. The U.S. dollar continues to be the global reserve currency. Treasuries are the global reserve collateral asset, which means that the U.S. enjoys what Charles de Gaulle once referred to as an exorbitant privilege. Eventually, as Herb Stein once said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. One thing I learned firsthand during my 4 years in Washington as Fed Vice Chair is that there are very few things in Washington that Republicans and Democrats agree on, one of which is that the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path.
Fed always say they're data dependent. Having been in the room when these decisions were made, what does data dependent really mean in practice? What does the Fed need to see?
Central banks are data dependent. It's also fair to say that depending upon circumstances and shocks to the economy, central banks can be more or less data dependent that they are, and I think with good reason, because they're now close enough to their 2% inflation target that they can be looking more broadly at data on the labor market. And the Fed, by statute, has a so-called dual mandate, that it's charged to achieve price stability and maximum employment. And now that they're getting close on inflation, they are now shifting some of their attention and calculation to the state of the labor market, and thus their comments that if we see a material additional softening in the labor market, they would be prepared to cut even if the inflation data doesn't improve from here.
We've now seen ECB and others cut rates already. Do you think others will follow? And from your prior experience at the Fed, how much do global central banks really coordinate, or where they don't?
A couple things. Global central bankers spend a lot of time meeting face-to-face and talking in person and comparing notes. They meet 5 times a year in Switzerland at the BIS. They meet twice a year in Washington at the IMF World Bank. They meet at the Central Policy Conference that the ECB organizes in June. They meet at the Jackson Hole Conference. There's a G20 meeting. There's a G7 meeting. In addition, central bankers set up phone calls, video conferences. The best known example is in October of 2008, after the global financial collapse of Lehman, there was an explicitly coordinated rate cut where all the major central banks cut rates on the same day at the same time. But that's really the exception. But what we do observe, Justin, in markets is we observe positive policy coordination. We observe rate hike cycles across countries, rate easing cycles. And what drives that is not so much coordination as the fact that we tend to have globally correlated business cycles with global inflation going up and down, and thus central bank reaction functions will deliver correlated policies. But they do spend a lot of time talking to each other, that's for sure.
Also, on top of mind is the coming U.S. election. What should investors be watching out between now and November?
I don't think this election really will have any particular influence on what the Fed does in the next couple of years. Interestingly enough, there are more similarities in both trade and fiscal policy. There will be important differences, though, in the details, in the fact that if you had a clean sweep by the Republicans, we'll probably have at the margin larger deficits because less of the outlays will be paid for with tax increases. On the other hand, the Biden folks, if they come in, would probably like to hike taxes, but they probably wouldn't be able to get a lot of those through Congress. And so unfortunately, regardless of which party's elected, we're going to have an unsustainable and significant fiscal problem in the U.S. There would be big differences in regulatory policy, also big differences in the sectors that are winners and losers. And so a lot of what will be important to investors in the years ahead, depending on the election, is going to be just as much about micro and sectoral bottom-up analysis as it will be macro, I think.
What do you think, some of the economic policies are aligned or different? And what do you think are the implications to different sectors from an investment perspective?
Some of that's going to depend upon whether or not whoever is elected president has control of the Congress. But it does seem increasingly likely now that if a Republican is elected, that he will have a Republican House and a Senate. And whereas if a Democrat is elected, there's not a small chance that Congress may continue to be divided. And so the details will differ between the two, but there will be some commonalities. Both parties are parties and have platforms that will focus on industrial policy, protectionism. I would point out that most, if not all, of the Trump tariffs are still in place after 3+ years of a Biden administration. I mentioned a moment ago that there are very few things that the parties in Washington agree on. Another thing they agree on is the U.S. should have a more protectionist policy with more of a focus on industrial policy, picking winners and losers. I want to state that at least for the first year or so of the next president, there really won't be any impact on the Fed as an institution, simply because a president's ability to influence monetary policy is a function of the vacancies that he can fill to the Federal Reserve Board. And right now, and they're looking ahead, there will be no vacancies until the second year of the president's term.
One question we frequently get from our investors or clients is the Fed may hold off in the election year. Does Fed really hold off during the election year, or not necessarily?
I think it's crystal clear to me that the election outcome, or trying to get a little bit cute and hold off on rate adjustments until after the election, is not really what they're thinking. I think if we get a good reading on the PCE inflation numbers, we'll get 2 more CPI reports, We'll get 2 more labor market reports. And if those are lining up and showing an economy that's running at or below trend with a constant or rising unemployment rate and falling inflation, I think they'll cut in September and likely cut in December.
Historically, inverted curve means a pretty good chance of recession as an indicator, and it looks like it is not the case this time. And why is that, in your opinion?
An inverted curve is simply a situation where the yield on a short maturity treasury, say a 3-month treasury, is above the yield on a 10-year treasury. That is abnormal. Inverted curves tend not to persist, and inverted curves tend to re-steepen when economies go into recession and central banks cut rates. It's not an infallible signal. We've had a couple of occasions in the U.S. where curves inverted and that was not followed by a recession. Now, I would argue that sometimes the correlation could be spurious. For example, the U.S. yield curve inverted in 2019, and I, of course, was following that then because I was Fed vice chair. And we did have a recession in 2020, but in January of 2020, there was no recession in sight. Unemployment was at a 50-year low. Inflation was just a touch below target. The Fed had cut rates in order to provide an insurance cushion against the economy. Yeah, there were some mumblings about a trade war, but looked to have been fully absorbed. And so I would argue that the correlation between the inverted curve in 2019 and the recession in 2020 was entirely spurious because of the pandemic collapse. I think had there not been a pandemic, there would not have been a recession.
Can you walk us through some of your thinking in terms of outlook for public fixed income?
Investors can put together a high-quality portfolio of sovereign bonds, investment-grade corporates, mortgage-backed securities, perhaps some private credit or hedge fund allocation. These are equity-like returns at a fraction of the vol with the potential for capital appreciation if in a future downturn, and there will be a future downturn at some point, the Fed cuts rates aggressively, bond yields can fall and deliver a capital gain.